Hello, I have a question.
Yes,
First of all, thank you for sharing your time and knowledge with us. Can you hear me? Good?
I can hear you well. Yes.
Okay, well, I have a question about gandabba in general. If you can tell us about what you know about gandabba, and then a following up question to that.
Okay. So when it comes to the gandabba, as far as I understand it, and as far as I have read about and understood it from my own contemplation about it, there's two understandings of gandabba. Gandabba is also related to in Sanskrit, they call gandharvas, which are in the sensual heavens, specifically, as far as I'm aware, the Tavatimsa heavens. And there is the other understanding of gandabba as being a carrier for karma. So when we talk about rebirth, for example, from one lifetime to the next, that specific word that's sometimes used in the suttas is gandabba. That is the rebirth linking consciousness, which transfers the formations from one lifetime to the next lifetime. So it is known as also the evolving consciousness. It's translated sometimes as that as well.
So in that second understanding, it's really only that very brief becoming of the next, like the in between the last and the very first consciousness of the new being.
Yeah, so like what you would say is, for example, at that point of death, the craving arises. That craving then gives rise to formations that the mind clings to. The effect of that clinging gives rise to a new consciousness. That new consciousness itself is the gandabba, which then becomes the first consciousness, which then dissipates as soon as it lands or takes root, let's say, into the new nama rupa, into the new mind and body.
Okay. What about the understanding of gandabba residing in paraloka, netherworld?
Are you talking? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
My current understanding is or was that there is a netherworld, paraloka, being mentioned in the suttas. And for instance, if there is merit for being for being a human being, and then let's say that human being the life ends before the merit for a human being is over, and then it returns to the paraloka until the next condition is given to become a human being.
So what you're talking about is like a phase where there's an interval period. There's like an intermission between one life to the next. And this is sort of like a purgatory kind of place, like a waiting area.
Yes, exactly. That's what I read about it. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I don't know if I've come across it in the suttas myself, but my understanding is that rebirth is spontaneous. And spontaneous means not just spontaneous generation in the Deva lokas or in the Brahma lokas or in the hungry ghost or hell realms, but spontaneous meaning there is no antarbhava. Antarbhava is the specific Pali term, even though there is actually a term for antarbhava parinibbati, which is for the anagami. And usually the way the commentaries talk about it is that the anagami will go into this interval period or become an arahant just before landing and all these other notions. But to clarify that particular thing of the antarbhava, what they're talking about is just before the end of that previous life. Because even the systems of the bardos, as I understand it, or as I interpret it from my understanding of the suttas, these are all still within the mental realm of that mind just before it passes away. So the experiences that seem to be near-death experiences, the experiences that seem to be bardo or interval periods or these kinds of things are still happening in the scope of that particular nama rupa of the previous life before it takes birth into a new life.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Delson.
Hello?
Can you hear?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I have a question about near-death experience. Like many people which revive after, like they die for a moment. They most of the time they explain like they seen a being, like a very big guy with white beard and going through the tunnel. It is very like common experience for people explaining near-death experience. So whose are those being like that big guy, and what is that tunnel like most of people go?
So this is going to be dependent upon the belief system of that particular individual. So if a person has a specific kind of belief system, then they will have an interpretation of those beings in the way that they have been brought up to think of those beings. And those are dependent upon the sankharas of that mind. So some people have visions of angels, or some people have visions of devas, or some people have visions of animals. Some people have visions of half human, half animals. Some people have visions of hungry ghosts. And that's all dependent upon the formations. If the quality of formations have been rooted in greed, hatred, or delusion, there is a tendency for that mind to have remorse, or a tendency for that mind to bring up fear, or a tendency for that mind to bring up some kind of negative, unwholesome emotion, which then gives rise to further craving, which gives rise to resistance and aversion, and so on. And when that happens, that effect of that fear can give rise to rebirth in a lower realm, because that person is fueling that experience. That's why if you ever come across some of Bante's talks, Bante Vimarahamsi's talks, he talked about how when he was in the nursing home and at the hospice, when people passed away, they sometimes experienced some kind of unwholesome emotion, and that gave rise to an experience of this otherworldly being that was maybe scary or frightening to them. And Bante would try to get them to let go of that and start to take the precepts, and then start to get more wholesome in their mindset after they took the precepts. And that, at least at that point in time, allows them to let go of that and then deviate or incline their mind towards wholesome states of mind, which lead to wholesome existences in the future. So what you might refer to might be common among some people, but not all people. Some people report, seeing light at the end of the tunnel. Some people report seeing some kind of being or some kind of angelic being, and so on. So I would just say that those things, though they seem common, they're actually dependent upon formations, which in itself are dependent upon previous choices and experiences. So, for example, if somebody is brought up in a certain kind of belief system, which is, let's say, a Christian belief system, for example, and they have a certain notion of how angels look or how certain heavenly beings look, and they have wholesome mindsets, they might start to envision those beings as being angelic, dependent upon their idea of what they look like. Or if somebody's been brought up in a, let's say, Buddhist or Hindu or Indian belief system, then they will have visions of devas if they have wholesome mindsets, because that's how they equate a heavenly realm to be. That's how they equate heavenly beings to be.
Thank you for the explanation. Can I ask one more question? So,
Sure.
yeah, it's okay to mix metta and anapana. Uh,
I'm not able to hear you actually. Can you say that again?
uh, it is okay to mix anapana and metta like in one setting.
No, not at all. If you want to follow the instructions that are given for the metta practice, that is basically experiencing the metta as a feeling in the chest. It's a warm feeling in the chest, and you allow the mind to rest in that feeling. But you have nothing to do with the breath. If you want to do just anapana, then you don't focus on any kind of feeling in the chest. You're just using the instructions that are there in the Anapanasati Sutta.
I have a follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Can we
Go ahead.
use 6 hours for anapanasati?
Yeah, why not? You could use 6 hours for any object of meditation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So Delson, question from my side. You talked about the precepts and that it gives, that it helps the mind to be tranquil, and I also recall the conversation about the relationship between taking the precepts and the hindrances which arise during one's meditation. Could you elaborate a little bit on that in terms of how, in the mind, in our meditation, we have hindrances coming up that actually relate back to, in previous times where we may not have followed one of the precepts?
Yeah. So let's talk about hindrances. We have specifically 5 hindrances that are mentioned in some suttas, but there are also upakilesas. There are other hindrances that are mentioned, for example, in Majjhima Nikaya 1-8. But the 5 basic hindrances that we understand are sensual craving, aversion, restlessness, doubt, and sloth and torpor. And they will arise because of having broken a precept in the past. So there was some point in time, whether it was in this lifetime or whether it was in a previous lifetime or many lifetimes ago, where a precept was broken, and the effect of that. Because when you break a precept, the idea of breaking a precept is with intention. That means that if you harm a living being or kill a living being, there has to be intention. If you accidentally step on a bug because you didn't see it, there was no intention in there, so that's not actually breaking a precept. But you see a bug and you stomp your foot with intention to kill that insect, then there is intention there. Or any of the other precepts that we talk about, if you break them with intention, then in the next moment or in the next series of moments or at some future time, it will arise as a form of a hindrance. So you look at it from the context of formations, choice, and intention and karma. If there was an intention to break a precept, that intention was followed through, and therefore that is karma in the form of activity. That activity gives rise to further formations that deviate the mind towards those hindrances, deviate the mind towards unwholesome choices. And those hindrances that arise as an effect of the previous choices of breaking those precepts. So it's a snowball effect. And then when they arise, those hindrances are to be treated as old karma. Old karma is that which is to be experienced and felt. But if you react to a hindrance in the form of trying to control it, trying to suppress it, trying to push it, trying to do anything with it except for 6Ring it, then you will further aggravate those hindrances from to arise. You will strengthen those hindrances. You will strengthen the restlessness or the sloth and torpor or whatever it might be. But if you 6R it, what you are doing is practicing right effort, and you are practicing the Eightfold Path. And as we understand the Eightfold Path, it is also the path leading to the cessation of karma, specifically old karma. So when you act through right effort by understanding and recognizing here is a hindrance, not trying to push it, not trying to pull it, just seeing it, releasing your attention from it, relaxing the formations, that is to say, relaxing the craving attached to that, then re-smiling so that you come back to a wholesome object, and then returning to your object of meditation. In this case, if it's metta or any of the brahmaviharas, and then maintaining that and repeating anytime the hindrance comes again. The thing about this is the hindrance will arise. It might arise again, but it will be weaker because you haven't aggravated it. You haven't strengthened it with any kind of reaction outside of the scope of right effort. If you use right effort, you weaken the hindrance, and therefore it will arise, but much weaker, and eventually it will fade away completely. Now, there is a connection between, as I understand it, and as I put forward, the understanding of the hindrance and the precept that is taken or broken in this case. So when you kill, when you harm or you kill with intention, that brings up aversion, that brings up ill will. When you have any kind of taking that is not given, when you steal and you take something that is not freely given, that gives rise to restlessness. When you have any kind of sensual misconduct that includes sexual misconduct, that is to say, you become attached to some kind of sensual experience to the point of harming others or harming yourself, that gives rise to sensual craving. When you use false speech, that gives rise to, or that false speech, by the way, could include slander, could include harsh speech, could include gossip, all kinds of things. When you do any of that, that can give rise to the hindrance of doubt. And when you indulge in any kind of intoxicants, alcohol or drugs or whatever it might be, that can give rise to sloth and torpor because it dulls the mind. So the reason why I put forward in this way is because if you think about it, when you have an intention of ill will, that is liable to cause the hindrance of ill will. When you have this need to take something that is not given, whether it's possessions, whether it's credit, whether it's seeking attention where it's not given, then that's liable to cause a restless and agitated mind, a mind with remorse and anxiety and so on. When you have any kind of sensual misconduct, when you become attached to any kind of sensual experience and act in a way that is unbefitting of the Noble Eightfold Path, then that invariably will cause you to create or strengthen that hindrance of sensual craving. When you use false speech, when you use gossip, when you use slander, you start to doubt other people. And that also translates into doubt about yourself. And it also translates into doubt about what is wholesome or unwholesome. And therefore, there is the hindrance of doubt that arises. And finally, when you indulge in any kind of intoxicant, that could also include reading or watching the news too much, or playing video games for a long time, or spending too much time on the internet and so on. That can dull the mind, that can dull the senses, that can dull the mindfulness. And therefore you can have sloth and torpor.
Hello, can I ask my question?
Yes, you can.
Thank you very much. So my question is, I have heard that paranirvana is like the definition that I heard, like an annihilation. It's like an extinction completely of what was this person. And so does paranirvana is like what we believe about death, that it's the termination of the soul? And if it's the case, why one would wish to attain or to be in a paranirvana?
Yeah. Parinirvana or paranibbana, as it's known in Pali, parinirvana is the Sanskrit. That is basically the eradication of, or the ending of, the five aggregates. When somebody becomes an arahant, they are no longer a being because they no longer attach or identify with any of the five aggregates. But they are neither a non-being as well. The reason I say that is because there's the understanding that there was no self as we understand self to be to begin with. So the notion that parinibbana is annihilation comes from the idea that there must be some sense of self, and it's the complete annihilation of that self at parinibbana. But the realization of nibbana in itself, and specifically with the realization of awakening in the form of arahantship, in full liberation, is the understanding that there is no more becoming, there is no more coming into being, there is no more renewal of existence. And what that means is the definition of a being is that where there is an attachment and identification of an idea of self with one or more of the five aggregates. But in the case of the arahant, they have completely let go of any kind of identification with any of the five aggregates. So parinibbana is nothing more than just the dissolution of the body. And that mind of the arahant experiences final nibbana, or nibbana for the final time. And then the aggregates are dissolved. So it's not really an extinction. It's not really an annihilation. It is the cessation of the five aggregates for the last time, for the final time. And the understanding is that rebirth, right, as we understand rebirth in this wheel of samsara, it is suffering. The reason why everybody is here is because there was craving at some point that led to a rebirth in this lifetime. And the situation is such that one doesn't recall previous lifetimes. And so there is just this idea of one life from birth to death. But as you realize that there is rebirth happening in every moment and there is no control over it, and it becomes tiresome, you have an intrinsic understanding of dukkha, moment to moment. And that can be extrapolated on the macro level and understood that if rebirth exists here and if rebirth exists on the macro level, then it is suffering to having to come back to samsara in one way or another. And so the cessation of rebirth is equal to the cessation of suffering. And therefore, when you talk about parinibbana, there is no more arising of any kind of new consciousness that will take further rebirth in a new life, and so continue that cycle of samsara. So really what we're talking about is the dissolution of the aggregates and no longer having any more rebirth in what is really the majority of samsara is suffering. So it's a process in which there is no more coming into suffering anymore.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
There is also another question, if I may. So it's about the jhana. I have heard many different definitions about jhana, about how deep meditating state must be to be a jhana. So some first jhana can be very light, and we can even hear things around us. And some first jhana are so deep that it's very, very hard to reach them. And I was wondering if both definitions can be right. Is there something similar between a light first jhana and a very deep first jhana, like a similar pattern that happened?
Yeah. So the way we've experienced jhana through the twim practice is where if there is contact with the body or contact with any of the six sense bases, there is an awareness of that. Because what we're doing is it's not just jhana, but it's not just samatha, which incorporates jhana, but it's also vipassana, which is to say it incorporates insight. That's why twim is called tranquil wisdom insight meditation, because there is an understanding of things as they arise in the practice, as they arise in the meditation. So the jhana that is there in which there is no contact or there is no contact experienced, meaning there's no sensation experienced, where if somebody were to tap on the shoulder or call the person by their name, that's a very, very deep, concentrated jhana. But in that process of that deep, concentrated jhana, it also suppresses the mind, which includes the hindrances. So if you're suppressing the hindrances, you're not really having any kind of transformation. This process of jhana, if you want to call it light jhana, is really where you are in a collected state of mind, not a one-pointed, focused, concentrated state of mind, but a mind that has the attention on its object of meditation, but the awareness is open enough so that if hindrances arise, they can be dealt right there and then, using right effort, using the 6R process. And at the same time, it gives space for insights to arise as well. So when we talk about the sutta jhanas, really that's what we're talking about, where the jhanas aren't so deep and concentrated that it suppresses the mind, but rather there is the right balance of samatha and vipassana, serenity and insight, so that you're able to be collected enough and calm enough in your mind to be able to see the hindrances and to be able to see the insights and deal with the hindrances using right effort.
Okay, thank you very much.
If I may, I have a question.
Yes. It's good to see you.
Very nice to see you, Delson. Thank you. Very nice to see everyone. So this is not a question on the practice, it's more a question on a sutta that I read, and I have some questions on that. It's a story about a person who was basically a murderer, and he was in the woods, and he wore a garland of fingers. The question is about, it was kind of interesting how the running of the Buddha and he was chasing him and all that was kind of interesting. But that's not the question. The question was, when he became, I guess, a bhikkhu, and or he became either whatever attainment it was, but the people in the neighborhood were still throwing things at him because they considered him a murderer. And there was a woman that was pregnant or something like that, or had a child, and the Buddha told him, just tell them that you're not, that you didn't do that. Did he tell him that because he was reborn and he was no longer that person? And he could say that because it almost seemed like a lie, so to speak, right? Because he was a murderer before, right? That's the first question. You know, why would he say that he didn't do this thing that he used to do? And I'm assuming it was because he was reborn. And then the second question is, there was a note with regards to he was of noble birth, right? That individual who was a murderer was of noble birth. And it seemed like because of that, it was easier for this person to attain this attainment. And was that because people of noble birth had a prior life that was good, and that's why they were born into noble birth, and it was easier, I guess, to have this attainment? So those are the two questions, and I excuse myself if that was a bit confusing.
No, I understand the question, but I think I'm going to need the aid of our sutta expert here, Sil, just to clarify what Umberto said in reference to the woman giving birth.
I don't remember it actually. I was a bit surprised to hear Umberto say that because I don't remember it. So I'm not going to be helpful for you today, Delson.
I think it was 140 something.
140 something.
Wasn't there an Angulimala Sutta or something like that?
I know there is one in the Theravada, but the numbering is so confusing that I can't find it currently. It's with these Roman letters. So
yeah. I think it's 86 here. It says the Angulimala Sutta, but I don't know if it's.
I did read this in the Majjhima Nikaya.
Right,
Majjhima Nikaya.
86. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, let me see. And it was number, you said?
86, I believe. 86.
86. Ah, yes, okay. Yes, he saw a certain woman in difficult labor, in painful labor. When he saw this, he thought, how beings are afflicted. Indeed, how beings are afflicted. And then he goes back to the Buddha, tells him about that woman and that thought. And the Buddha says, in that case, Angulimala, go into Savatthi and say to that woman, sister, since I was born, I do not recall that I have ever intentionally deprived a living being of life. By this truth, may you be well and may your infant be well. And then Angulimala says, Venerable Sir, wouldn't I be telling a deliberate lie, for I have intentionally deprived many living beings of life. Then Angulimala, go into Savatthi and say to that woman, sister, since I was born with the noble birth, I do not recall that I have ever intentionally deprived a living being of life. By this truth, may you be well and may your infant be well. So, yes, that is the part. And then he attains arahantship.
Oh, he attains arahantship after that, after giving her the merit, basically. Okay. So noble birth, as I understand it, would mean that he entered the stream at the very least. Since he entered the stream, because then when they use the word noble, it comes from the word arya. So when they use, for example, a noble disciple, it comes from the word noble arya savaka. Whenever you see the word noble in that context, it's talking about somebody who has attained nibbana at least one time, who has entered the stream at the very least. So since he entered the stream, he did not, since that point onwards, he didn't kill anybody. He didn't commit a murder. And therefore, if he's telling the truth, may that person be well. Now, the other point to understand about stream entry is it cuts off any kind of liability of entering any lower realm below the human realm, because now right view has been understood. The Four Noble Truths have been seen. There is an understanding of the path, and there's no longer any doubt in the path. There's no longer, so the first three fetters, which can cause rebirth in lower realms, has been eradicated. Now, what's also interesting to note, you mentioned before, which is that the people, they started throwing stones at him because they were still angry and upset of the fact that he had committed murders before, which shows that even whether it's a stream enterer or whether it's an arahant, they still have to experience the effects of their previous actions prior to awakening, especially prior to full awakening. One prime example of this, which I use often, is the example of Mogallana. Mogallana was one of the chief disciples of the Buddha. And in one of his previous lives, it's understood that he killed his parents. And the immediate birth that he had was then in a hell realm. But the seed of that experience, the seed of that karma was still latent in that mind, latent in that life. So even after attaining arahantship, he had to experience the effect of his previous unwholesome choices. And just because you become fully awake doesn't mean that you eradicate any possibility of further consequences of previous choices, previous decisions and actions that you took prior to full awakening. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one more question, if I may.
Yeah.
When someone becomes a stream enterer and they see a dependent origination happening, and they are in their day-to-day life, and individuals may be unpolite to this individual, and you see this unpolite nature, and it could provide compassion and understanding that the person is reacting to their conditions and consequences. When that happens, it's almost like an annoyance for that individual. Should they just 6R that annoyance?
Yes. Yes. The point here is, if you notice, if somebody notices that there is an irritation at another person being impolite or being rude or being belligerent or whatever it might be, you consider that, or it is in that reality, but you consider that for the mind, that this is an effect or a consequence of something you did in the past to that person at some point or another. And so this is the effect of that choice, the effect of that action. Now, if the mind were to take that personally and attach onto it and then react from there, then what's happening is you're continuing to strengthen that cycle of karma. But if you see it as being impersonal and seeing that that is that person's choice to be in that way and send them loving kindness, and you notice the irritation and you 6R it right there and then you don't consequently strengthen that reaction from them. And instead, maybe they'll react again, but because they've seen a different side of you, let's say, or a different way, which is rooted in loving kindness, which is rooted in compassion, they may think of what they said, or they may think of what they did, and may react differently a second time. But regardless of how they react, that's their responsibility. One's responsibility is to see how the mind processes and reacts to that situation. And if it has any kind of aggravation, if it has any kind of irritation, then one notices that and 6Rs it, and then replaces it with loving kindness and compassion.
Thank you. There's one more question.
Yeah.
In the twim practice, we learn to share loving kindness and even compassion. You can also do this with equanimity. That's the question?
Yeah. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Oftentimes, loving kindness might be needed because you see a person is in conflict with you, or there's two people in conflict and you radiate loving kindness to them and you radiate compassion to them. Compassion, as we understand it, is basically giving the space to the other person who is suffering to be able to be in their suffering. Because if you take that away from them, then it takes away the possibility of them to learn from it and be able to uplift themselves from that. So compassion is being there for them, but not being a crutch for them, not being some kind of escape from that. Nobody here is a savior of another person. Everybody is responsible for their own experiences and how they deal with those experiences. You can be there as a support and radiate compassion. When we talk about joy in the meditation, the experience of joy in the meditation, the mudita, is just this very content joy. But in day-to-day life, there are people who have wholesome successes. And so you can radiate joy to them for being happy for their success. You can radiate equanimity towards a person if they are upset, or you see that they're irritated with you, or you see that there is pain that is arising in you from what they're saying, and you can radiate equanimity. And first you 6R, let go, and radiate equanimity. Equanimity is wonderful because if a person is in pain, mental or emotional or physical pain, and you start radiating equanimity, you are sort of the anchor for them, and you're able to give them advice that is rooted in the Eightfold Path. And you're starting to be able to show them a way to behave that doesn't cause further suffering for them when you have that equanimity. There was an example given, I don't know if you recall, an example was given at the retreat while you were there and while I was there by Bante, where at a funeral, I think it was one of his relatives who passed away, and he radiated equanimity to everybody. And they were in grief, but they were also feeling balance, and they were feeling uplifted and elated, calm and collected. So you can radiate the brahmaviharas according to the situation.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I would have a question that I thought of because of the earlier question from Koen about the precepts. You could say for creating kamma, let's say, that there is an intention. I'm talking about the results of kamma, let's say, for instance, a beautiful or a nasty rebirth. So there is the intention of kamma. There is also the amount of wholesome or unwholesome kamma that is being accumulated. But there seems to be a third factor, namely doing something to certain beings. For instance, a very positive one would be giving a gift to a Buddha. A very bad one, when one can't attain stream entry in the next life, would be killing a parent, for instance. Could you explain more about that third factor?
Yeah. Like, let's take the example of the unwholesome action of killing a parent, or any of the immediately effective actions, as we could put it. And the reason is because you think about the action itself that somebody committed, which whether it was killing a parent, whether it was killing an arahant, whether it was causing a schism, whether it was drawing blood of a Buddha, which, you know, with the intention to harm at that period in time when the Buddha was alive, that is liable to cause a very, very unwholesome mind state. So in that dissolution of the mind and the body in that life, the immediate thought that arises is, what have I done? Like, I killed my parent, or I did this, and there's immediate remorse for that. That remorse is the fuel for the formations that cause the experience into a hell realm, that, you know, the lowest hell realm, which is the immediate rebirth. Likewise, when you are generous and you give to somebody like Stream Entro, a noble one, or, you know, an arahant, or anybody, the experience is so wholesome, the experience is so immediate that you feel so uplifted that at the dissolution of the body, the mind might think about that. And because of that last thought, the fuel of that can cause a more wholesome rebirth, a more positive rebirth. So that third factor is the immediately effective karma, dependent upon the strength of the formations that arise, dependent upon that choice, dependent upon that action.
Okay, so let's make this a bit harder. I'm giving to a Pacheka Buddha, and I don't know that they are a Buddha. I'm just giving a gift.
Yeah.
Would that have the same result then?
Yes, it would.
Okay.
Yeah, the reason is because you're giving to somebody whose mind state is absolutely pure. And that purifies the gift and that purifies the other person, because that person, that being, immediately accepts it and has gratitude for it. And there is an upliftment that you might not feel in that moment, but the karma of that is still there, because your intention is to give, regardless of whether you knew that that person was a Pacceka Buddha or a fully enlightened Buddha or an arahant or a stream mentor. The intention of giving itself uplifts the mind, and the extent to which you give, or the extent to who you give, purifies the gift and purifies that mind state as well.
And the reverse of that, for instance, killing a parent and you never knew they were your father, for instance.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good question.
You can just say I have no idea, but it came up.
You ask good questions, so I would say, even if you didn't know that that parent was your parent and you still killed, there would still be an immediately effective action because of it, because there was still an intention to kill there. There was still an intention there. And in terms of karma, remember, it's impersonal. So it's not just about your personal actions, but on the ultimate reality level, let's say, there is karma completely. So that karma is non-judgmental, and it doesn't keep track to an extent of, oh, I killed this person, I killed that person. It's the effect of that. The effect in itself, whether you knew it or not, but there was intention behind it, is what can cause the person to go into a hell realm. So even if that person didn't know that they killed their father, or even if that person didn't know they killed their mother, the effect of that is so bad that there is that impersonal effect on that being. When they die, they have remorse for it. It immediately comes up. It's just automatic. It immediately comes up that I killed this being. And there can be, in that moment, there could be knowledge that arises that this was my parent at some point in time, or this was my parent in this lifetime. Take it for what it's worth, okay? So this is obviously not in the suttas, so that's a disclaimer.
I have a question.
Yes.
And good morning, afternoon, evening to all of you. Thank you for holding this. I really appreciate it. I have more of a path question, if you will. I've kind of, like you, not as far, gone through different paths of, most recently working within his Rinzai Zen lineage. Had interest in Kriya Yoga and Ramana Maharshi and so forth. And I'll try to make this really specific, really succinct. I'm 26 right now, and I'm finding just sort of that classic, I don't know what to do with my life sort of thing. And yet the more I'm following this path and any sort of, whatever, call it what we will, glimpses, experiences, insofar as their experiences, all that sort of stuff, I'm feeling more and more called to this, whatever this is. And I've had a lot of, like questions about maybe becoming a monk, or and I take the commitments that come with something like that very seriously, which is why I've never taken precepts or anything with any lineage or tradition. And I'm at this point where I'm like having to choose between the path, whatever that means, and I might be going into real estate, for example, like getting my license, maybe possibly getting my license in the next few months. And it's clear I don't want to do it at all. And I feel like I almost like I have to, and yet I feel like I'm sort of about to throw on the golden handcuffs, if you will. And I'm wondering, because I was really inspired by, the Guru Viking interview definitely caught my attention. And I was really inspired by how you were able to navigate all these different things, and it just kind of like, felt like that was what I really wanted, you know. I've had, you know, maybe I go to India, maybe I go somewhere, but it's always the kind of the questions of like, what if I ruin my life and making this decision? Because there's plenty of monks that, you know, are still miserable, and despite their attainments, you know, they're a mess of a person still. And I just kind of like wanted to kind of just get your take on that. And because I'm finding I'm just really indecisive about this, and you know, it's kind of time still passing, and I'm like, feel like I'm not making a decision, and yet I don't know what to trust at all. And yeah. So.
Well, I mean, I can't speak for you in terms of what you should do or what you shouldn't do, but I can give you what opportunities are available. Number one, you could always try a temporary ordination and see how that works for you, and see if there's any benefit for you in doing that. Number two is you could not do a temporary ordination and do this practice and see how it works for you first. And then when you do make some kind of progress and you get inspired and you have more clarity on what you want to do, whether you want to still be in the lay life or you want to go ahead and become a monk, you can then at that point in time take temporary ordination and do a step-by-step process. So take temporary ordination, see how it works, how it feels, become a samanera, and then from there become a bhikkhu, so on. So the indecisiveness, I think what you should do is ask your intuition. This is an exercise that can be done in the form of just clearing the mind and just asking the mind, what is it that should be done in this moment? Or what is it that should be done when presented with these two choices or these series of choices? Let go of the question and go about your day. And the answer will strike your mind like an insight, like a eureka moment. And that is the intuition or the intuitive mind giving you the response. And then follow through from there.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I'll do that. And just a really, really quick question. Have you found that with all the different lineages and stuff you've practiced, you know, there's sort of the question of like, I'm sort of feeling more and more disillusioned by the things of like all paths leading to the same place. Have you found that there are significant degrees of finality or end, if you will, like say with this practice and or Hinayana Theravada stuff versus say the Kriya Yoga and all that and whatnot?
Yeah. So what you have to understand is that syncretic view that all paths lead to the same thing is one kind of view. It's one kind of notion, one kind of idea.
Yeah.
And it's based on whatever it might be. But you also have to see that any practice that you do, whether it's Kriya Yoga or any of the other practices, start off with a certain foundational understanding of reality. There's a claim of subjective and ontological reality, whether you talk about Vedanta, whether you talk about yoga, whether you talk about Sankhya. In the case of, let's say, here, when we're talking about the Theravada view, for example, or let's say Suttavada, which is right view, comes in the form of two levels, the mundane and the supermundane, the relative and the absolute, so to speak. So the relative has to do with karma, the understanding of action and consequence, the understanding of dependent origination, the understanding of rebirth at some point in your life, the understanding of having gratitude for your parents, the understanding of that there are teachers out there who know this path and who can show you the way, and so on and so forth. And there is the understanding where you have the experience of nibbana or nirvana, and you come to some kind of understanding of, or a clear understanding of dependent origination, a clear understanding of how the links arise and how this process of suffering arises and how this process of ceasing suffering is done through the Eightfold Path. So what I'm saying here is these other paths have their own views to start off with, which then lead them to coming back to that view, but on an experiential level. So for example, in Vedanta, the view is that there is the Atman and there is the Brahman. And so in the suttas, it talks about that there is a viewpoint which says that the self and the world are one and the same, and that they're immortal or they're eternal. That's the view that you already have on a foundational theoretical perspective in Vedanta, for example. Then you go through a process which then allows you to experience that, because your view from that foundation has conditioned that experience for you. But here, what we're saying is this is the mundane right view, which has to do with morality, which has to do with ethics, which has to do with samadhi practice and so on. And then there is the supramundane, which has to do with coming to the unconditioned, the experience of nibbana itself. So the unconditioned, that experience of the unconditioned, the very fact that it's called the unconditioned means that there is no view conditioning it. It comes to a point where you go from wrong view from the perspective of this path to right view, to no attachment to any views, including no attachment to right view as well. So the experience of nibbana happens because you see how causes and conditions bring up suffering, and you cease those causes and conditions and come to the unconditioned. The other paths, let's say, if I were to comment on them, have their own views, and those views are still having an experience that is tied to the conditioned mind in one way.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, and if I could ask, is it okay if I ask just one more brief question?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
You were speaking earlier with one other gentleman regarding people who come from different belief systems in their path, and rebirth and all that sort of stuff. And I grew up as a sort of puritanical atheist, if you will. Is there anything of like, because the Christian view, for example, is there may be different experiences or memories of different lives, but it doesn't pertain to the individual, for example. I'm just curious, like how that might apply for me. Like, is there possibly possibly a one go for some people and an end, or yeah, I've been kind of curious on that.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I would say only you could answer that, because you have to go walk the path and see for yourself what happens.
Fair
but
enough.
My suspicion would be that if you do walk the path, you will no longer be a hardcore atheist. You'll have
I'm not anymore, trust me. That's been long gone. That was the first bit of liberation. Oh God. All right. Thank you. I really appreciate this. Pleasure to meet you.
Welcome. You as well.
Delson, I have a follow-up question to Kairan's question, if I may.
Yes. Yes, go ahead.
So there's an understanding that if one to take on the robes, whether they be temporarily or permanent, there should be, if one has a child or children and they are younger than being adults and leaving the house, I would think that there is a responsibility as a parent to that child, one being financial and the other being emotional.
Yes. Yes.
The question is begged that, from my understanding, and I'm very ignorant, that the Buddha left his home at the age of 29 or something like that, and he had a child. Can you reconciliate that for me, please?
So from my understanding, and take it for what it's worth, the Buddha or the Bodhisattva at that time was disillusioned with all of the sensual pleasures that he was experiencing. And after having seen, because if you take into account the traditional story of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva, which is his father basically blockaded him from experiencing any kind of vision of grief or death or sickness or aging or anything. This is how the traditional story goes. And now this is interesting. So the idea is that he had some kind of disillusionment or disenchantment with the sensual realm or the sensual pleasures. There's a story, and I'm saying this because I was corrected before by our expert Sil in regards to the story of seeing the 3 or the 4 visions, which was actually the Vipassi Buddha who experienced it. But the idea is that he saw these 4 things, previous Buddha, or one of the previous Buddhas. He became disillusioned and disenchanted and then went on a search. Now, as to whether he had a family or not, I don't know about him specifically, but to reconcile the idea that he left his house or he left his home, what I understand it is that there was a very strong desire to understand suffering and to let go of suffering with the intention of coming back and teaching others how to let go of that suffering. So I believe the traditional story goes is that he wanted to discover the path that would lead to the end of suffering. And he experienced it. His intention was to then come back and be able to teach others. Now, in that moment of enlightenment, after he had that full awakening, he had doubts about whether he could teach this because it was so subtle and so deep and so profound. And then you had the story of the Brahma, one of the Brahmas coming and saying that there are those with little dust in their eyes, meaning there are those who could possibly understand this. So please go and teach. And he did so. So when he came back, he actually then had his son, Rahula, become a monk. And he had him become ordained as a bhikkhu, a fully ordained bhikkhu. And then Rahula became an arahant as well. And he attained the cessation of complete suffering. So I think that's one way of reconciling. So he did come back and then he did help his son attain ultimately. And the other thing you have to see is now, when, as far as I understand the Vinaya, and I understand it very little, so understand that I don't know much about the Vinaya, but I do know that if there is responsibilities in the lay life specifically, or if there is debts to be paid, or if you have loans and things you haven't paid off, or your parents are still alive and you don't have their permission to go ahead, you cannot go ahead and fully. So there are certain rules and regulations before you actually fully ordain. And the Vinaya is an evolution of rules and regulations dependent upon situations that the Buddha and the other monks encountered in their time. And then that was laid out. And so now in the present day, if you were to fully ordain, there are certain requirements that you need to fulfill before you.
Very helpful. Thank you.
Maybe to add that I haven't found a sutta where this story can be found about the Buddha leaving his wife and child. When he leaves, his parents are saying goodbye to him with tearful face, not his wife, who was already after having childbirth, of course, probably laying in bed. But I'm not sure if that story is actually true. I also have yet to encounter a sutta where Rahula is being called or acknowledged as the Buddha's son. So I'm not completely sure about certain things that seem common knowledge, but when you scrutinize them, it's hard to find them in the suttas themselves, which for us are the basis, not the commentaries.
Yeah,
that's helpful also. Thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't take into account that there is no explicit mention of Rahula necessarily being the Buddha's son. That's interesting. Any last questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Can I ask you?
Yes, go ahead.
Volition determines the activities of mental states associated with it. Because today's earlier answers, your answers, from the point of intention or anything. And from the ethical standpoint, it determines the inevitable consequences. If that volition in the supermundane level is called wisdom, as you said, that wisdom or panya or anything, all such implements having with him, how a supermundane arahant, Mogallana, how can he get into that particular kamma? That is my doubt.
Yeah. So you have to understand again, this understanding of him experiencing the effects of his previous choices. So you have to understand, so the arahant no longer produces new karma. The arahant no longer produces any new consequences for actions. But the arahant is still prone to experiencing the effects of previous choices. So that includes even choices made in previous lifetimes. Take the example of the Buddha. Again, this is coming in from maybe it's a commentary, maybe it's a Jataka tale, but as far as I understand it, the Buddha experienced back pain a lot in his lifetime. And the understanding is it's because he was a wrestler in a previous lifetime. And he had this signature move, which was the backbreaker. He would, hold people and then break their backs. And that's obviously intentional. And that effect of that caused him in that next life as the Bodhisattva and then as the Buddha with back pain. So any fully enlightened being still has to experience karma, still has to experience the effect of previous volition. But they no longer produce new volition that is rooted in a wrong way, that is rooted in a way that is liable to cause further karma or further consequences of those acts.
So it is in the shape of some Shankaras.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have one last question, please.
Yes.
I have heard the Buddha spent the morning hours in compassion meditation.
Yeah.
So what would be the benefit over the other three brahmaviharas? Why would he choose that?
Well, for one, it's a great pick-me-up. It's a great replacement for caffeine. When you wake up in the morning and you do compassion meditation. I mean, I speak from my own experience. When I do compassion meditation, I don't need any caffeine. I don't need any tea or coffee. My mind is alert and ready for the day. But I would say, I know on a more supramundane level, he was probably using compassion as a way of seeing, as they say, with his mind's eye, to see if there was anybody in need of the Dhamma, if there was anybody who was ripe for experiencing awakening. And I can say this from one's own experience and experience with other students or other meditators, which is to say that one time we did an exercise where we actually did compassion meditation. And now you could say it was a placebo effect, or maybe it wasn't, who knows. But the experiment was you had two different people facing each other, and that person would radiate loving kindness or compassion to the second person, and they would see if they felt it, and vice versa. And there was one meditator who did it, and he was radiating compassion all throughout, and he started to experience or be able to see that somebody in his family was in some kind of pain and some kind of suffering. And so it helped him to recognize that. It helped him to see that and be able to connect with that person. And so there are experiences where you do compassion, which is, remember, associated with infinite space. So you're actually moving through this experience of being able to see if there are other beings suffering, and then be able to help them if you can. So I would say that would be one of the reasons why the Buddha would have done it.
Absolutely makes sense. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay. If there's no more questions, let's share some merit.
May suffering ones be suffering free, and the fear-struck fearless be. May the grieving shed all grief, and may all beings find relief. May all beings share this merit that we have thus acquired for the acquisition of all kinds of happiness. May beings inhabiting space and earth, devas and nagas of mighty power, share this merit of ours. May they long protect the Buddha's dispensation. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.